Alan Watts stands as one of the most captivating and transformative voices in 20th century philosophy. Born in England in 1915, he'd grow up to become the bridge between Eastern wisdom and Western consciousness, a philosophical entertainer who made ancient insights feel immediately relevant to modern life. His ideas challenged the very foundations of how Western culture understands the self, reality, and the nature of existence itself. He spoke in a way that made complex philosophical concepts feel like conversations with a wise friend over tea. His voice, warm and playful, yet deeply serious, would reach millions through radio broadcasts, lectures, and books that continue to reshape how people think about consciousness and reality decades after his death. Watts lived during a time when Western civilization was experiencing a crisis of meaning. Two world wars had shattered confidence in progress and rationality. Traditional religious frameworks were losing their hold on educated people. Science had revealed an apparently meaningless universe governed by mechanical laws. Into this spiritual vacuum came Alan Watts, offering not new dogmas, but rather a completely different way of seeing that drew from Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Vedanta philosophy. He didn't ask people to believe anything, but rather to wake up to what was already happening, to see through the illusions that Western culture had mistaken for reality itself. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to hear from you. If this content resonates with you, a quick like or subscribe would mean the world and helps our community grow. I'm always curious about our global audience, so drop a comment letting me know what city you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's amazing seeing how these ideas connect people across time zones and continents. Now, get comfortable. Maybe adjust your pillows. Turn on some gentle background noise if that helps you relax. And let's settle into tonight's exploration together. We're going to discover why you might not be who you think you are. Part 1. The Illusion of the Separate Self. Watts began his philosophical revolution with what might be the most radical claim anyone can make about human existence. The fundamental sense you have of being a separate, isolated self trapped inside your skin, looking out at a foreign universe, is an illusion. Not a poetic metaphor, not a spiritual teaching that requires faith, but a demonstrable mistake in how you've learned to experience reality. This illusion, Watts argued, is the primary source of human suffering, anxiety, and the sense of alienation that haunts modern life. Understanding this illusion and seeing through it isn't just an interesting intellectual exercise. It's the key to transforming your entire relationship with existence. Think about how you typically experience yourself. You feel like there's someone inside your head, behind your eyes, observing the world. This observer seems separate from everything you observe. Your body feels like a vehicle you're driving. Your thoughts feel like things happening to you. The world outside your skin feels foreign, potentially threatening, definitely separate from the real you that exists somewhere inside. This experience feels so obvious, so self-evidently true, that questioning it seems absurd. Of course you're a separate individual. Of course the boundary of your skin marks the boundary between you and not you. But Watts asked us to look more carefully at this experience. Where exactly is this separate self? When you search for it with genuine attention, what do you actually find? You find thoughts, but are you your thoughts? They come and go without your conscious control. You find sensations, but sensations are constantly changing, arising and passing away. You find memories, but memories are unreliable, constantly being rewritten, and they describe a person who no longer exists. You find emotions, but emotions flow through you like weather patterns, beyond your ultimate control. So where's this stable, separate self that supposedly exists independently from all these changing phenomena? Watts pointed out that the sense of being a separate self is something you learned. It wasn't given to you by nature. It's a social convention, a way of organizing experience that Western culture has trained you to adopt. From the moment you were born, parents, teachers, and society taught you to think of yourself as a separate individual who must achieve, compete, and defend yourself against a potentially hostile universe. They taught you to identify with your name, your body, your thoughts, your possessions, your achievements. They taught you that you're responsible for controlling yourself, and that failure to do so represents a moral failing. This constructed sense of self creates what Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, a feeling that you're a separate entity trapped inside a bag of skin, fundamentally divided from everything else that exists. This illusion has profound consequences for how you experience life. It creates anxiety because this separate self feels vulnerable, always potentially under threat. It creates loneliness because you feel fundamentally isolated from others. It creates the constant sense that something's missing, that you need to acquire, achieve, or become something other than what you are to finally feel complete. But what if this entire framework is mistaken? What if the boundary between you and the universe isn't as clear as you've been taught to believe? Watts invited us to consider a radical alternative way of understanding what you are. Instead of being a separate entity that somehow came into the universe from outside, you're something the universe is doing right here and now. Just as the ocean creates waves, the universe creates people. The wave isn't separate from the ocean, even though it has its own temporary form and movement. Similarly, you're not separate from the universe, even though you have your own temporary form and perspective. This isn't just poetic language or mystical metaphor. It's pointing to something you can verify through careful attention to your actual experience. Notice how your body isn't actually separate from its environment. You're constantly exchanging matter and energy with the world around you. Every breath you take brings the outside world inside. Every exhalation returns part of you to the environment. The food you ate yesterday is literally becoming your body today. The atoms that make up your cells right now will be somewhere else in a few months. Where exactly does your body end and the environment begin? Even more fundamentally, consciousness itself isn't contained inside your skull. The experience you're having right now is a seamless unity of what you call subject and object, self and world, inner and outer. These divisions are conceptual, not experiential. When you actually pay attention to what's happening, you don't find a separate observer inside watching the world. You find an undivided process of experiencing that you've artificially split into experiencer and experienced. Watts loved to point out that you don't exist in isolation any more than the front of something exists without its back. You and your environment are two aspects of a single process. You're not in the universe the way raisins are in a cake. You're something the universe is doing in the same way that a tree produces apples. The universe has peopled just as it is starred and galaxied. You're not a stranger visiting a foreign realm. You're an expression of this cosmos, as natural and belonging as clouds in the sky or waves on the ocean. This insight has immediate practical implications. If you're not fundamentally separate from the rest of existence, then the constant project of defending and promoting this isolated self is unnecessary. The anxiety about not being enough, about needing to achieve and acquire to finally feel complete, is based on a misunderstanding. You're already completely connected to everything. You're already a full participant in the cosmos. Nothing needs to be added to make you legitimate or real. Understanding this doesn't mean losing your individuality or your capacity to function in practical life. Waves don't lose their wave nature when they recognize they're made of ocean. Similarly, you don't lose your personality, your preferences, your unique perspective when you see through the illusion of the separate self. You just stop taking it so seriously. You stop treating your ego as if it were your ultimate identity. You recognize it as a useful social convention, a way of organizing experience, but not as an accurate description of what you fundamentally are. This shift in understanding changes everything about how you relate to existence. When the desperate sense of separation dissolves, what remains is the simple recognition that you're happening along with everything else, that your existence is inseparable from the existence of everything around you, that you're a temporary expression of the same energy that expresses itself as galaxies and atoms and everything in between. Part 2. The wisdom of insecurity. Watts observed that modern life is characterized by an overwhelming sense of insecurity that drives people into increasingly frantic attempts to establish certainty and control. We save for retirement, buy insurance, make plans, construct identities, accumulate possessions, all in a desperate attempt to create some stable ground in what feels like a shifting, uncertain world. But Watts argued that this entire project is fundamentally misguided because it's based on a misunderstanding of what security actually is and how life actually works. The search for security, he suggested, is itself what makes you insecure. Think about the typical approach to life that Western culture encourages. You're taught to plan for the future, to sacrifice present enjoyment for future security, to constantly worry about what might go wrong and take steps to prevent it. You're encouraged to build walls around yourself, both literally and metaphorically, to protect yourself from a world that's portrayed as dangerous and unpredictable. Every advertisement tells you that you need their product to finally feel safe, successful, or satisfied. Every social institution emphasizes the importance of stability, security, and predictable outcomes. But what does this constant pursuit of security actually achieve? Watts pointed out that it primarily achieves anxiety. The more you try to make life predictable and controllable, the more you become aware of everything that could go wrong. The more insurance you buy, the more you think about all the disasters you're insuring against. The more you save for the future, the more you worry about whether you've saved enough. The more you try to control circumstances, the more you notice how much remains outside your control. The pursuit of security becomes an endless treadmill, where achieving one form of security immediately reveals another form of insecurity that needs to be addressed. This approach to life rests on what Watts identified as a fundamental confusion about the nature of existence. You're treating life as if it were something that can be made permanent, predictable, and controllable, when in fact life is characterized by constant change, uncertainty, and interdependence. Everything that exists is temporary. Everything that happens is interconnected with countless other factors beyond your knowledge or control. The universe isn't a mechanism that could theoretically be made completely predictable with enough information. It's a living, dynamic process that's inherently creative, spontaneous, and open-ended. Trying to make life secure is like trying to make water not wet. You're working against the fundamental nature of what you're dealing with, and the effort to do so cuts you off from actually living because you're constantly focused on the future rather than the present, on what might go wrong rather than what's actually happening, on protecting yourself rather than participating fully in existence. Watts suggested that genuine security comes not from trying to eliminate uncertainty, but from developing a different relationship with it. Instead of seeing change and uncertainty as problems to be solved, you could recognize them as the very nature of life itself. Water flows, fire burns, and life changes. This isn't a defect that needs fixing. It's what makes life dynamic, creative, and interesting. Without change, nothing new could ever happen. Without uncertainty, there'd be no possibility for surprise, discovery, or growth. The wisdom of insecurity involves recognizing that the search for perfect safety is actually a form of death. Complete security would mean complete stagnation, nothing ever changing, nothing unexpected ever happening, every moment perfectly predictable and controlled. But this wouldn't be life. It'd be a kind of living death, existence without vitality or spontaneity. The very things that make you feel insecure, the unpredictability of life, the constant change, the impossibility of complete control, are also what make life interesting, dynamic, and worth living. This doesn't mean being reckless or failing to make reasonable preparations. Watts wasn't suggesting you shouldn't look before crossing the street or save money for things you'll need. He was pointing to a much deeper psychological pattern where you're constantly living in an imagined future, worried about what might happen, never fully present to what is happening. You're sacrificing the only time you actually have, this present moment, for a future that never arrives, because when it does arrive, you're still focused on the next future moment. Consider how most people think about retirement. They spend decades working at jobs they don't enjoy, sacrificing present pleasure and meaning for the promise of future security when they'll finally be free to really live. But when retirement arrives, they often don't know how to actually live because they've spent their entire life preparing for life rather than living it. And then they discover that aging and death are just as uncertain as everything else. So the security they worked toward was always somewhat illusory. Watts suggested that this approach has it backwards. The real question is whether you're actually living right now, not whether you'll be able to live someday in the future. The same pattern appears in relationships. People enter relationships seeking security, looking for someone who'll provide stable love and companionship. But the attempt to make relationships secure often kills what's actually alive in them. You become possessive, controlling, constantly monitoring whether your partner still loves you, whether they might leave, whether you're doing everything right to maintain the relationship. This constant vigilance and control suffocates the spontaneity and freedom that love requires. Real love involves vulnerability, the willingness to be hurt, the acceptance that nothing lasts forever. The attempt to make love secure transforms it into something else entirely, perhaps a business arrangement or a prison, but not the living, dynamic connection it could be. Watts pointed out that everything you truly value involves risk and uncertainty. Creativity can't be made safe and predictable because it involves venturing into the unknown. Adventure, by definition, means not knowing what'll happen. Love means opening yourself to another person without guarantees. Play means engaging in activity for its own sake, without predetermined outcomes. Growth means changing in ways you can't anticipate in advance. Everything meaningful involves uncertainty, so the attempt to eliminate uncertainty actually eliminates meaning. The wisdom of insecurity involves what Watts called letting go. Not giving up or becoming passive, but rather releasing the constant psychological clinging that tries to make everything solid and permanent. It's recognizing that you can't actually hold on to anything because everything's constantly flowing and changing anyway. Your thoughts, your feelings, your circumstances, even your sense of self, all of it's in constant motion. The attempt to grasp and hold creates suffering because you're fighting against the nature of reality itself. This letting go is actually a great relief once you genuinely try it. The burden of constantly trying to control everything, to make life turn out according to your plans, to protect yourself from every possible danger, it's exhausting. Releasing that burden doesn't mean things suddenly become perfect. It means you stop adding psychological suffering to whatever challenges actually exist. You meet life as it comes, rather than constantly worrying about how it should be, or might be, or could be. Watts loved to use the metaphor of a river. You can't make a river secure or predictable. It's constantly flowing, changing its shape, responding to countless conditions. But you can learn to navigate it, to work with its nature rather than against it. You develop skill at reading the water, at adjusting to conditions, at moving with the current rather than fighting it. This doesn't give you control over the river, but it gives you something better: genuine responsiveness to what's actually happening, rather than rigid attachment to how you think things should be. The wisdom of insecurity ultimately points to a different way of being alive. Instead of postponing life until you've finally established enough security, you could recognize that security is impossible and start actually living now. Instead of treating uncertainty as the enemy, you could see it as the space where everything interesting happens. Instead of trying to make life safe, you could learn to be more fully alive in the midst of life's inherent uncertainty and change. Part 3. The nature of time and the eternal now. Watts identified one of the deepest sources of human suffering in the way we've been taught to think about time. Western culture encourages a linear conception of time where the past is gone, the future hasn't arrived, and the present is a razor-thin moment between them that's barely there before it vanishes. This way of thinking creates a psychological state where you're almost never fully present to your actual experience because you're constantly focused on past regrets or future anxieties. But Watts argued that this entire framework misunderstands the nature of time and traps you in an unnecessary form of suffering that dissolves once you recognize what time actually is. Think about how you typically experience time. You imagine yourself as moving through time, like a traveler moving through space, with the past behind you and the future ahead. The present moment seems fleeting and unsatisfactory, always giving way to the next moment. You remember the past with nostalgia or regret, wishing things had gone differently, or longing to return to better times. You anticipate the future with hope or anxiety, planning for what you want to achieve, or worrying about what might go wrong. The present moment itself often seems like just a transition between past and future, not worthy of full attention because you're focused on where you've been or where you're going. This temporal consciousness creates profound dissatisfaction with existence as it is. The present never seems quite sufficient because you're always comparing it to an idealized past or an anticipated future. You're either remembering when things were better or expecting that they'll be better soon, which means the present moment is just something to get through on the way to somewhere else. You postpone actually living, always waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right feeling, never recognizing that the only moment you ever actually have is this one. But Watts pointed out something radical about the nature of time that completely transforms this picture once you really understand it. The past and future don't actually exist. They're concepts, mental constructions, ideas you hold in your mind right now. The past is a memory occurring in the present. The future is an anticipation or projection occurring in the present. Everything you've ever experienced, you experience now. Everything you'll ever experience, you'll experience now. There's literally never been a time that wasn't now, and there never will be. This isn't a mystical or poetic claim. It's a simple observation about your actual experience if you pay careful attention to it. You cannot find any evidence in your direct experience for the existence of time as a container or medium through which you're moving. What you find instead is an eternal present, a now that's always here, within which memories arise and anticipations occur, but which itself doesn't go anywhere or change into something else. When you remember yesterday, that remembering is happening now. When you plan for tomorrow, that planning is happening now. Even the sense of time passing, of moments flowing from future through present into past, is an experience that's occurring now. The content of your experience changes constantly, but the nowness within which it's occurring never actually becomes something else. It's always now, and it's always been now, and it'll always be now. Watts suggested that understanding this deeply transforms your relationship with existence. Instead of constantly living in psychological time, divided between memory and anticipation, you can recognize that you're always already in the only time there ever is. This doesn't mean ignoring memory or failing to make practical plans. It means recognizing that these are activities happening now, rather than ways of escaping from now into some other time that has more reality. The eternal now isn't something you need to achieve or attain. It's what's already happening, what's always been happening, what you've somehow managed to overlook because you're so focused on the narrative of time as a linear progression. It's like a fish who's looking everywhere for water while swimming in it. You're looking everywhere for the present moment while you're already in it. You've never been out of it, and you couldn't be out of it because there's nowhere else to be. This recognition changes the quality of experience dramatically. When you're no longer psychologically located in past or future, an incredible richness of the present moment reveals itself. The taste of food becomes more vivid when you're actually tasting it rather than thinking about something else. Conversation becomes more engaging when you're actually listening rather than planning what you'll say next. Walking becomes more interesting when you're actually feeling your body move rather than treating it as mere transportation to somewhere else. Watts emphasized that this isn't about forcing yourself to concentrate on the present or using willpower to stay mindful. That approach just creates another form of struggle, another project to achieve. It's more about recognizing what's already the case and relaxing into it. You don't need to do something to be present, because you already are present. You're just adding a layer of abstraction on top of presence by constantly thinking about other times. The eternal now also transforms how you understand goals and accomplishment. Western culture is deeply goal-oriented, always focused on achieving something in the future. But if the future never actually arrives, if it's always now, then a life focused exclusively on future achievement is a life that never actually arrives at anything. You're always on your way, never arrived, perpetually postponing the actual living until you've achieved whatever goal you've set for yourself. This doesn't mean abandoning goals or failing to plan. It means recognizing that the activity of pursuing goals is happening now and could be fully lived now, rather than treated merely as a means to some future end. When you're writing, you could actually be writing, rather than focused exclusively on having written. When you're studying, you could actually be studying, rather than thinking only about the exam you'll take later. The doing becomes its own justification, rather than just a means to something else. Watts often used the metaphor of music to illustrate this point. You don't listen to a symphony just to get to the end. The entire point is the listening itself, the unfolding of sound in the present moment. If you spent the whole concert thinking about the finale, you'd miss the symphony entirely. Similarly, life isn't something to get through on the way to some final destination. The whole point is the living itself, the unfolding of experience in the eternal now. This understanding also changes how you relate to death. One of the deepest sources of anxiety is the anticipation of death, the fear that time will run out before you've accomplished what you want or experienced what you hope to experience. But if you recognize that you're always in the eternal now, death loses some of its terror. The now doesn't die. Content arises and passes away within it, including eventually the content of your personal existence. But the present moment itself isn't subject to birth and death. It's what birth and death happen within. This isn't a teaching about personal immortality or an afterlife. It's recognizing something about the nature of this moment that's free from the burden of temporal anxiety. When you're not constantly focused on how much time you have left, you can actually be alive in the time that's here. The finitude of life becomes an occasion for appreciating its preciousness rather than a source of constant worry. The eternal now reveals that life isn't something happening to you in time. Time is something happening in the eternal present of your experience. The narrative of your life, with its past, present, and future, is a story arising now. The story has its uses, helps you navigate practical life, gives coherence to experience. But mistaking the story for the reality is like mistaking a map for the territory. The map represents the territory, but isn't the territory itself. Similarly, your narrative about time represents your experience, but isn't the experience itself. When Watts talked about the eternal now, he wasn't encouraging people to become irresponsible or ignore consequences. He was pointing to the possibility of being fully alive right now, rather than constantly postponing life until some future moment that never actually comes. This shift doesn't require belief or faith. It's available through simple attention to what's actually happening versus what you're thinking about what's happening. The thinking is fine, useful, necessary for practical life. But it isn't the totality of what's here. There's a dimension of existence that's always present, always available, always now, that most people miss because they're so caught up in psychological time that they never notice the timeless ground of this moment itself. Part 4. The Backwards Law. Watts identified what he called the backwards law, a peculiar characteristic of human psychology where the more you pursue something, the more it eludes you. This principle applies to almost everything people genuinely value: happiness, peace of mind, spontaneity, love, wisdom. The direct pursuit of these qualities tends to produce their opposite, while relaxing the pursuit often allows them to arise naturally. Understanding this backwards law reveals something profound about human nature and offers a radically different approach to living than the one Western culture typically encourages. Consider the pursuit of happiness, perhaps the most universal human goal. Western culture encourages you to actively pursue happiness through achievement, acquisition, and self-improvement. If you're not happy now, the thinking goes, you need to change your circumstances, achieve your goals, acquire certain things, or improve yourself in various ways. Happiness is treated as something you can chase down and capture through the right combination of effort and strategy. But Watts pointed out that this approach typically produces the opposite of its intended result. The constant pursuit of happiness keeps reminding you that you're not currently happy. The gap between your present state and your desired state becomes a source of dissatisfaction. Moreover, happiness by its nature is spontaneous and self-forgetting. When you're genuinely happy, you're not thinking about happiness. You're absorbed in whatever you're doing. The moment you start monitoring your happiness level, asking yourself if you're happy yet, you've already stepped outside the experience and turned it into an object of pursuit. The same pattern appears with peace of mind. You can't find peace by chasing after it because the very act of chasing creates agitation. Trying to force your mind to be calm just adds another layer of mental activity. Commanding yourself to stop worrying just gives you something else to worry about. The attempt to think your way into not thinking creates more thinking. Peace of mind isn't achieved through effort, but through the cessation of the effort to achieve it. Similarly, with spontaneity and naturalness, Western culture often encourages people to be yourself and act natural. But the harder you try to be spontaneous, the more contrived you become. The more you try to be natural, the more self-conscious you feel. Real spontaneity happens when you're not thinking about it. Real naturalness occurs when you've stopped trying to achieve it. The attempt to control your spontaneity defeats the purpose entirely. Watts saw this backwards law operating in countless areas of modern life. People try to fall asleep, which creates tension that prevents sleep. They try to impress others, which creates anxiety that makes them less impressive. They try to be creative on command, which blocks the natural flow of creativity. They try to not think about something, which makes them think about it more. The pattern is universal. Direct pursuit creates its own obstacle. This phenomenon reveals something important about how human consciousness works. The controlling, grasping aspect of mind that tries to achieve goals is useful for certain practical tasks, like building a house or solving a math problem. But it's counterproductive for other aspects of life that require a different quality of consciousness. You can't command yourself into wisdom any more than you can command yourself into humor or grace or love. The backwards law also shows up in spiritual seeking, which Watts found particularly ironic. People pursue enlightenment, spiritual awakening, or higher consciousness with the same goal-oriented mentality they use for everything else. They practice meditation, hoping to achieve certain states, study philosophy to accumulate spiritual knowledge, attend workshops to become more enlightened. But this approach treats enlightenment as something you don't have that you need to get, which reinforces the very sense of lack that spiritual understanding is supposed to dissolve. Watts pointed out that if enlightenment is recognizing what you fundamentally are, then the search for it implies you're something you need to become, rather than recognizing what you already are. The seeker is looking for water while standing in a river. The search itself becomes the obstacle because it's premised on the assumption that you're separate from what you're seeking. When you recognize you're already the water, the search becomes unnecessary and actually somewhat amusing in retrospect. So what's the alternative to this goal-oriented pursuit that defeats itself? Watts suggested something he called purposeful purposelessness, or goalless activity. This doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on accomplishment. It means engaging in activity for its own sake, rather than exclusively as a means to some future end. It means doing things because they're worth doing now, not just because of what they might lead to later. Consider the difference between playing music and practicing scales. When you're genuinely playing music, you're absorbed in the activity itself. The sound, the rhythm, the expression, all of it's happening now and is valuable now. When you're practicing scales, you're typically focused on future performance, treating the present activity as mere preparation for something else. Both activities involve playing an instrument, but the quality of consciousness is completely different. Watts encouraged what he called playfulness as an alternative to the grim seriousness of goal-oriented achievement. Play is activity, engaged in for its own sake, without instrumental purpose. When children play, they're not trying to get somewhere or achieve something. They're fully absorbed in the activity itself, which is its own justification. This playful quality can be brought to almost any activity once you recognize that the activity itself is the point, not some future result it might produce. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibility or failing to plan. You can still make plans and work toward goals, but the quality of consciousness changes. Instead of treating the present as mere means to the future, you recognize that the present is all you ever have. The activity of pursuing goals is happening now and could be fully lived now, rather than merely endured as a bridge to somewhere else. The backwards law also suggests a different approach to personal problems and psychological difficulties. Western psychology often encourages people to work on their problems, to identify what's wrong and fix it through therapeutic intervention or self-improvement. But this approach can reinforce the sense that something's wrong with you that needs fixing. The very attempt to solve the problem of anxiety can create more anxiety about whether the solution is working. Watts suggested that sometimes the most helpful approach is to stop trying to fix yourself and simply observe what's actually happening without judgment. When you watch anxiety without trying to make it go away, often it dissipates on its own because you're no longer adding fuel to the fire. When you allow sadness to be present without needing to fix it, it often moves through more quickly than when you resist it. The acceptance of what is paradoxically allows change to happen naturally, while the resistance to what is tends to keep problems stuck in place. This principle appears in Eastern traditions like Taoism and Zen, which emphasize non-striving and spontaneous action. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-doing or effortless action, points to this quality of allowing things to happen naturally rather than forcing them. It doesn't mean inaction, but rather action that flows spontaneously from the situation without the interference of controlling ego consciousness. Zen practice often uses the backwards law to help students break through conceptual thinking. A famous Zen koan asks, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" The question can't be answered through conceptual thinking. Trying harder to figure it out just creates more confusion. The answer comes, if it comes, through giving up the attempt to answer and allowing insight to arise naturally. Watts applied this principle very practically to modern life. Instead of constantly striving for happiness, he suggested simply noticing that you're alive now and allowing that recognition to generate its own quality of appreciation. Instead of trying to force yourself to be present, he suggested recognizing that you're already present and relaxing into it. Instead of pursuing enlightenment as something you don't have, he suggested recognizing that the awareness reading these words is already the consciousness you're seeking. The backwards law ultimately points to a paradox at the heart of human existence. You can't get what you most deeply want through pursuit, but you can discover you already have it when you stop pursuing. The happiness you seek is the natural state that emerges when you stop seeking. The peace you chase after is the ground of consciousness that's always present when you stop chasing. The self you're trying to improve or perfect is the very mechanism that's preventing you from recognizing what you already are. This doesn't provide a technique for getting what you want more efficiently. It's pointing to the possibility of a completely different relationship with existence, one that's not based on lack and pursuit, but on recognition and appreciation of what's already here. The backwards law isn't something you can use to achieve your goals. It's an invitation to question whether the goal-oriented approach to life is serving you, or whether it's time to try something radically different. Part 5. The taboo against knowing who you are. Watts proposed one of his most provocative ideas, that Western culture maintains a kind of social taboo against genuinely knowing what you are. Society encourages you to identify with your ego, your separate personality, your individual achievements and failures, but it actively discourages you from recognizing your deeper identity as consciousness itself, as the universe experiencing itself through your particular perspective. This taboo isn't enforced through explicit rules, but through implicit social pressures, educational conditioning, and religious teachings that all reinforce the sense that you're a separate, isolated individual, fundamentally distinct from the cosmos around you. Think about how children naturally experience the world before they're thoroughly socialized. Young children don't have a strong sense of the boundaries between themselves and their environment. They're fascinated by everything, curious about everything, feeling their way into experience without the rigid categories that adults impose. They haven't yet learned to consistently identify themselves as separate egos that must defend themselves against a foreign world. There's a natural openness and wonder that hasn't yet been narrowed down into the contracted sense of self that characterizes adult consciousness. But the process of socialization systematically trains this openness out of children. Parents and teachers emphasize the importance of individual identity, personal responsibility, and social roles. Children learn they must achieve, compete, defend their territory, and establish their separate identity. They're taught to suppress certain feelings and express others, to conform to social expectations, to identify with their name, their family, their possessions, their accomplishments. The natural sense of participation in the world gets replaced by the sense of being an isolated observer, watching the world from behind their eyes. This process isn't done maliciously. Parents and educators genuinely believe they're helping children mature into functional adults, and in a certain sense, they are. The ego structure that society cultivates serves important practical functions. It allows people to navigate complex social environments, make plans, accept responsibility, and function as productive members of society. The problem isn't that the ego exists, but that it's mistaken for your fundamental identity, that you're taught this is what you really are, rather than recognizing it as a useful fiction, a social convention that shouldn't be taken as metaphysical truth. Watts argued that religious institutions, particularly in the West, have actively reinforced this taboo. Christianity traditionally teaches that you're a created being, fundamentally separate from God, that any claim to divine identity is blasphemy, that recognizing your unity with the source of existence is heretical pride. The doctrine of original sin emphasizes your fundamental wrongness, your separation from divine perfection, your need for external salvation. This theological framework reinforces the sense of alienation and separation that the ego structure already creates. The taboo becomes particularly clear when someone actually does recognize their deeper identity. If you tell people you've realized you're not fundamentally separate from the universe, that your consciousness itself, temporarily expressing through this particular form, that there's no separate observer inside watching the world, you'll typically be met with suspicion, concern, or dismissal. People will worry you're having a mental breakdown or that you've joined some weird cult. They'll tell you you're being grandiose or delusional. The social pressure to maintain the conventional sense of separate identity is intense. But Watts argued this taboo serves a particular social function. Society needs people to identify as separate individuals because that identification creates certain behaviors that maintain social order. If people truly recognized they're identical with everyone and everything, would they still compete ruthlessly in the marketplace? Would they still accept hierarchical authority structures? Would they still define success in terms of individual achievement? Would they still conform to social expectations that conflict with their natural inclinations? The separate self is also easier to control through social institutions. An individual ego that feels incomplete and inadequate is susceptible to advertising that promises fulfillment through consumption. A person who feels fundamentally separate from others is less likely to challenge authority or form genuine solidarity with others. Someone convinced they're a vulnerable separate entity is more likely to accept restrictions on freedom in exchange for promised security. The taboo against knowing who you are isn't just a conceptual mistake. It serves economic and political functions that benefit existing power structures. But what happens when you actually violate this taboo and recognize what you fundamentally are? Watts described this recognition using various terms: awakening, enlightenment, self-realization, cosmic consciousness. But these impressive-sounding terms can create their own problems by making the recognition seem exotic or difficult. In reality, what's being recognized is surprisingly simple, even obvious once you see it. You're not a separate ego trapped in a body looking out at a foreign universe. You're the universe itself, consciousness expressing through this particular perspective, the cosmos looking at itself through these particular eyes. This isn't a belief you adopt or a theory you accept. It's a direct recognition of what's actually happening. Right now, consciousness is occurring. Experience is happening. But where's the separate experiencer that consciousness is supposedly happening to? When you look carefully, you find only the experiencing itself, not some additional entity doing the experiencing. The sense of being a separate self is itself just another experience arising in consciousness, not the observer of consciousness. Recognizing this doesn't make you disappear or become some kind of impersonal void. Your personality continues, your preferences continue, your particular perspective continues. But the sense of desperate separation dissolves. You recognize you're a temporary expression of the cosmos, like a wave is a temporary expression of the ocean. The wave has its individual shape and movement, but it's never separate from the ocean. It's always ocean expressing itself in a particular form. This recognition transforms your relationship with existence. The constant anxiety about defending and promoting the separate self relaxes because you realize there's no separate self that needs defending or promoting. The loneliness of feeling isolated from others diminishes because you recognize everyone and everything as expressions of the same consciousness that's looking through your eyes. The fear of death becomes less overwhelming because you realize that what you fundamentally are doesn't die, even though this particular form will eventually dissolve back into the cosmos, like a wave dissolving back into the ocean. Watts emphasized that this recognition doesn't require years of meditation or ascetic practice or adopting any particular belief system. It's available right now through simple attention to what's actually happening. The taboo isn't maintained through physical barriers, but through psychological conditioning that directs your attention away from your actual nature. The recognition can happen suddenly, spontaneously, in the middle of ordinary life, when the conditioning momentarily relaxes and you see directly what's been here all along. But the taboo also protects people from this recognition because it can be disorienting, even frightening, to have your fundamental identity questioned. The ego structure that you've identified with your whole life feels like it's your most precious possession, what makes you unique and valuable. The suggestion that it's an illusion, that you're not fundamentally what you think you are, can feel like a threat to your very existence. The taboo creates psychological resistance that keeps most people from even seriously considering the possibility that they might be something radically different from what they've been taught. Yet Watts believed this recognition is absolutely essential for human flourishing in the modern world. The problems facing humanity, ecological destruction, endless warfare, social alienation, psychological suffering, all stem ultimately from the illusion of the separate self trying to protect and promote itself at the expense of everything else. Only by recognizing our fundamental unity with each other and with the cosmos can we hope to solve these collective problems. The taboo against knowing who you are isn't just a personal limitation. It's a collective obstacle that prevents humanity from addressing the existential challenges that threaten our survival. Breaking through this taboo doesn't require rebellion or rejection of society. It requires clear seeing, honest attention to what's actually happening rather than what you've been told is happening. The universe isn't hiding from you. You're it. You've always been it. The cosmic game of hide and seek, where consciousness pretends to be separate individuals, has been happening all along. The recognition that dissolves the taboo is simply consciousness recognizing itself. The universe waking up to what it's been doing all along through your particular perspective. Part 6. The Tao and the Art of Natural Living Watts. Found in Taoism, the ancient Chinese philosophical tradition, a profound alternative to the Western approach to life. Where Western culture emphasizes control, progress, and individual will, Taoism teaches flowing with the natural order, non-forcing, and harmony with patterns larger than individual intention. Watts spent decades translating these Eastern insights into language and concepts accessible to Western audiences, showing how Taoist principles offer solutions to problems that Western thinking has created for itself. His interpretation of Taoism remains one of his most influential contributions to cross-cultural philosophy. The central concept of Taoism is the Tao itself, a word that Watts said is better left untranslated because it points to something that English doesn't have an equivalent term for. The Tao is sometimes translated as the way, but it's not a prescribed path or set of rules. It's more like the natural order of things, the underlying pattern or intelligence that manifests in how rivers flow, how plants grow, how seasons change, how societies naturally organize themselves. The Tao is what's happening when nothing interferes with natural process. Western thinking tends to set human will and intelligence against nature, treating the natural world as raw material to be mastered and controlled through human effort. Descartes famously declared that humanity should become masters and possessors of nature. This adversarial relationship has achieved remarkable technological progress, but it's also created environmental destruction, social alienation, and a constant sense of struggle against forces that could instead be worked with. Taoism offers a radically different approach. Instead of trying to dominate nature, understand it deeply enough to flow with it. Watts explained the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, usually translated as non-action or non-doing, but better understood as effortless action or spontaneous activity. Wu Wei doesn't mean passivity or laziness. It means acting in harmony with the natural flow of situations rather than forcing outcomes through rigid willpower. Consider how a skilled sailor doesn't fight against the wind and water, but works with them, adjusting the sails to use natural forces. Or how a martial artist doesn't meet force with force, but deflects and redirects incoming energy. This is Wu Wei in action. The Taoist sage doesn't try to make things happen through forceful will. They observe patterns, understand natural tendencies, and intervene minimally at the right moments to achieve maximum effect with minimum effort. Water provides the key metaphor. Water is soft and yielding, yet it can wear away the hardest stone. It always flows to the lowest place, yet it's essential for all life. It adapts to whatever container it's placed in, yet it never loses its nature. The Taoist approach to life models itself on water, flexible, responsive, powerful through softness rather than force. This principle applies directly to psychological and social problems. When you're anxious, the typical Western approach is to fight the anxiety, to forcefully try to make it go away through willpower or distraction. But this fighting often intensifies the problem. The Taoist approach would be to observe the anxiety without resistance, to allow it space, to work with it rather than against it. Often, the anxiety dissipates naturally when you stop feeding it with resistance. Similarly, with social conflicts, the Western approach typically involves escalation, meeting force with force, asserting one's position more loudly. But this usually hardens opposition and creates endless cycles of conflict. The Taoist approach looks for ways to deflect conflict, to find solutions where all parties feel they've gained something, to address the root causes rather than fighting over surface disagreements. Power through softness rather than hardness. Watts was particularly fascinated by how Taoism understands the relationship between opposites. Western thinking tends to divide the world into opposing categories: good versus evil, light versus dark, mind versus body, self versus world. These dualities are treated as fundamental conflicts where one side must triumph over the other. But Taoism sees opposites as complementary aspects of a unified whole, like the two sides of a coin or the front and back of something. The yin-yang symbol expresses this perfectly. The black contains a spot of white, the white contains a spot of black, and they flow into each other in a dynamic balance. Neither can exist without the other. You can't have up without down, front without back, pleasure without pain, life without death. The opposites mutually define and generate each other. Trying to have one without the other is like trying to buy just the front half of something. This understanding transforms how you relate to difficult aspects of life. Instead of treating problems as enemies to be eliminated, you can recognize them as necessary aspects of the whole. Without difficulties, you couldn't appreciate ease. Without challenges, there'd be no opportunity for growth. Without darkness, you couldn't recognize light. The goal isn't to eliminate one pole of experience, but to understand how they fit together in the natural order of things. Watts applied this to the problem of death, which Western culture treats as the ultimate enemy to be fought and delayed as long as possible. But from a Taoist perspective, death is the necessary complement to life, not its opposite. Life and death are phases of a single process, like day and night, or breathing in and breathing out. The fear of death comes from identifying exclusively with the living phase and treating death as something foreign and terrible. But if you recognize yourself as the whole process rather than just one phase, death loses some of its terror. The Taoist approach to society and government is equally relevant. The Tao Te Ching, the foundational Taoist text, repeatedly emphasizes that the best government governs least. The wise ruler influences society through minimal intervention, allowing natural social order to emerge from the bottom up rather than imposing it from the top down. Excessive laws and regulations, the text suggests, actually create disorder by interfering with natural social cooperation. This doesn't mean anarchistic rejection of all government. It means recognizing that social order emerges naturally from human interaction when conditions are right, and that heavy-handed intervention often creates more problems than it solves. The role of government should be to create conditions where natural cooperation can flourish, then step back and allow it to happen, intervening only when absolutely necessary, and then with the lightest touch possible. Watts saw in Taoism a sophisticated understanding of systems, thinking that Western science was only beginning to rediscover in the 20th century through ecology and cybernetics. Taoism recognized that everything's interconnected, that actions have ripple effects throughout entire systems, that you can't isolate and control one variable without affecting countless others. This systems awareness leads to humility about human ability to control and predict, and to preference for working with natural patterns rather than trying to override them. The art of natural living that Taoism teaches isn't a technique to be mastered, but a way of being to be grown into. It involves developing sensitivity to natural rhythms and patterns, learning to feel when to act and when to refrain from acting, cultivating the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances rather than rigidly insisting on predetermined plans. It means trusting natural intelligence, both in yourself and in the larger processes you're part of, rather than relying exclusively on calculating intellect. Watts believed Western culture desperately needed this Taoist wisdom. The Western approach of dominating nature through technology has achieved remarkable things, but it's also created existential threats: climate change, ecological collapse, nuclear weapons that could destroy human civilization. These problems stem from the illusion that humanity is separate from nature and can control it without consequence. Taoism offers an alternative, recognizing our participation in natural systems and learning to work with them rather than against them. On a personal level, the constant Western emphasis on individual achievement, willful control, and forceful action creates enormous psychological stress. People exhaust themselves trying to make everything happen through personal effort, never recognizing that some things happen more easily when you stop trying so hard. The Taoist alternative of Wu Wei, of effortless action in harmony with natural process, offers relief from this exhausting approach to life. Watts didn't suggest that Westerners should simply adopt Taoism wholesale, or that Eastern wisdom is superior to Western science. He advocated for integration, for bringing Taoist insights about natural process together with Western understanding of technological possibility. The combination could create an approach to life that's both technologically sophisticated and ecologically wise, both individually empowering and socially harmonious, both intellectually rigorous and spiritually profound. The Tao, as Watts interpreted it, isn't a religious belief system requiring faith. It's an invitation to pay attention to how things naturally work and to align yourself with those patterns rather than fighting against them. It's the wisdom of the farmer who works with seasons rather than trying to force growth on his own schedule. It's the intelligence of the body that heals wounds without conscious instruction. It's the spontaneous cooperation that emerges when people with compatible purposes work together without rigid hierarchical control. The Tao is what's already happening when you stop interfering with it. Continuing with parts 7 to 15 to reach approximately 100,000 characters. Part 7. The Religion of No Religion. Watts maintained a complex and often misunderstood relationship with religion throughout his life. Ordained as an Anglican priest in his 20s, he later left the church, but never abandoned his fascination with religious experience and spiritual insight. He developed what he called the religion of no religion, an approach that takes spiritual experience seriously while rejecting dogmatic belief systems, institutional authority, and rigid theological frameworks. This perspective offered a way of being spiritually engaged without the problems he saw in organized religion. Traditional religion, Watts argued, makes a fundamental mistake by confusing the finger pointing at the moon with the moon itself. Religious doctrines, sacred texts, and theological concepts are supposed to point toward spiritual reality, but religions typically become focused on the doctrines themselves rather than what they point toward. People argue about interpretations of sacred texts, fight wars over theological differences, and judge others based on whether they accept particular doctrines. All of this misses the point entirely. The core of religious experience, Watts believed, is a direct recognition of the sacred dimension of existence. This isn't about accepting particular beliefs or following prescribed rituals. It's about a shift in consciousness where ordinary reality reveals its extraordinary nature, where the apparently mundane shows itself to be miraculous, where your sense of separation dissolves into recognition of your unity with everything. This experience is available to anyone, regardless of their beliefs or religious affiliation, because it's about how you see rather than what you believe. Most religions begin with someone having this direct spiritual insight. Buddha sat under a tree and recognized the nature of suffering and liberation. Jesus went into the desert and emerged transformed, speaking with authority about the kingdom of heaven. Muhammad received revelations that reoriented his entire understanding. Lao Tzu observed the patterns of nature and recognized the Tao. In each case, the founder had a direct experience of spiritual reality that transformed their consciousness. But then, Watts observed, something problematic happens. Followers gather around the enlightened person, and gradually, the focus shifts from having direct spiritual experience to believing correct doctrines about the founder's experience. Churches, temples, and mosques get built. Sacred texts get written. Theological systems get elaborated. Institutional hierarchies get established. Professional priests emerge who claim special authority to interpret the truth. And the living spiritual insight hardens into dead dogma that people defend without ever having their own transformative experience. This institutionalization serves certain social functions. It creates community, provides moral guidance, offers comfort in difficult times, gives people a sense of meaning and purpose. But it also creates problems. Religious institutions claim exclusive access to truth and condemn other paths. They demand obedience to authority and discourage independent spiritual exploration. They focus more on belief than experience, more on conformity than transformation, more on what you profess than how you live. Watts's religion of no religion attempts to recover the experiential core of spirituality while dispensing with dogmatic belief systems. Instead of asking what you believe about God, it asks whether you've recognized the sacred dimension of existence. Instead of demanding adherence to particular doctrines, it encourages direct spiritual exploration through whatever methods work for you. Instead of claiming one path is exclusively correct, it recognizes that different approaches work for different people, and that the goal is transformation, not theological correctness. This approach draws from multiple religious traditions without being exclusively committed to any. Watts freely synthesized insights from Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Christianity, and other traditions, taking what he found helpful and leaving aside what seemed unhelpful. Critics accused him of superficiality, of cherry-picking the pleasant parts of religions while avoiding their difficult demands. But Watts argued that rigid adherence to single traditions is itself a form of attachment that spirituality is supposed to help you overcome. He was particularly critical of the Western emphasis on belief as the core of religion. Christianity asks, "Do you believe?" as if accepting certain propositions about Jesus, salvation, and the afterlife is what matters most. But Watts pointed out that in Eastern traditions, belief is much less important than practice and realization. Zen doesn't primarily care what you believe about Buddha. It cares whether you wake up to your true nature. Taoism doesn't demand acceptance of metaphysical claims. It encourages you to align with natural reality as you directly experience it. The religion of no religion also rejects the Western tendency to place God outside the universe as a separate creator. Watts found the pantheistic mysticism of Hinduism and Taoism more compelling, where the divine isn't separate from existence, but is existence itself as recognized from a particular perspective. You're not separate from God, trying to reach God through proper belief or behavior. You're a temporary expression of the divine, God experiencing existence through your particular perspective. This doesn't mean everything's perfect, or that there's no genuine evil and suffering. It means the relationship between divine and human isn't one of separation and estrangement, but of identity and participation. Prayer isn't petitioning an external authority, but aligning yourself with the deepest nature of reality. Sin isn't disobeying divine commands, but missing the point, living from the illusion of separation rather than the recognition of unity. Watts emphasized that genuine spirituality produces practical effects in how you live, not just pleasant feelings or interesting beliefs. If your spiritual practice makes you more anxious, more judgmental, more rigid, something's wrong. Authentic spiritual insight should make you more relaxed, more compassionate, more capable of enjoying existence as it is. It should decrease rather than increase your sense of separation from others. He was skeptical of spiritual practices that focus exclusively on achieving special states of consciousness. Meditation is valuable, but if you're meditating to achieve enlightenment in the future, you're reinforcing the same goal-oriented consciousness that keeps you suffering in ordinary life. The point isn't to have extraordinary experiences that set you apart from normal people. It's to recognize the extraordinary nature of ordinary experience that's available right now. The religion of no religion doesn't require belief in personal immortality or an afterlife. Watts was agnostic about survival after death, suggesting it might happen or might not. But either way, it shouldn't be the primary motivation for spiritual practice. If you only care about spirituality because you want to go to heaven, you're still operating from self-interest. Genuine spirituality involves recognizing that your separate self is illusory anyway, so whether it continues after death becomes less urgent. This approach to spirituality without religion offered many people an alternative to both dogmatic faith and materialistic atheism. You don't have to accept Bronze Age cosmology or medieval theology to recognize the sacred dimension of existence. You don't have to deny the insights of modern science to acknowledge that reality has depth and meaning that purely materialistic explanations don't capture. You can be spiritually engaged while remaining intellectually honest and critically thoughtful. Watts's religion of no religion ultimately points toward spirituality as a quality of consciousness rather than a set of beliefs. It's about being awake to what's actually happening rather than caught in concepts about what's happening. It's about recognizing the miraculous nature of ordinary existence rather than seeking special experiences. It's about dissolving the sense of separation that creates suffering rather than affirming beliefs that promise future salvation. It's religion with experience at the center rather than belief, transformation rather than conformity, direct seeing rather than secondhand doctrine. Part 8: Technology, Nature, and the Ecological Crisis. Though Watts died in 1973, his insights about the relationship between humanity, technology, and nature have become increasingly relevant as ecological crisis has intensified. He recognized earlier than most Western philosophers that the environmental destruction emerging in the mid-20th century stemmed from fundamental conceptual mistakes about humanity's place in the natural world. His analysis of these mistakes and his suggestions for different approaches anticipated many themes of contemporary environmental philosophy and ecological activism. The core problem, Watts argued, is the Western illusion that humans exist outside and above nature, rather than as participants in natural systems. This illusion has deep roots in Western religious and philosophical traditions. The biblical creation story places humans in dominion over nature, given authority to subdue the earth and rule over other species. Descartes' dualism separated mind from matter, humans from nature, setting up an adversarial relationship where human consciousness faces a dead, mechanical world that exists only as raw material for human purposes. This conceptual separation enabled enormous technological development, but created a catastrophic blindness to consequences. If nature is just dead matter, external to human purposes, then there's no inherent reason not to exploit it completely for human benefit. Trees exist to be cut down for lumber. Mountains exist to be mined for minerals. Rivers exist to be dammed for power. Animals exist as resources for human use. The intricate web of relationships that sustains life becomes invisible when you see nature as mere material rather than as the living system you're part of. Watts contrasted this Western view with Eastern perspectives, particularly Taoism and Buddhism, that recognize humans as participants in natural systems rather than masters standing above them. In these traditions, the goal isn't to dominate nature, but to understand and harmonize with it. Nature isn't dead matter, but a manifestation of the same consciousness that expresses itself in human beings. Harming nature is harming yourself, because there's no fundamental separation. He was particularly concerned about technology's accelerating power to transform the environment. Technology itself isn't the problem, Watts argued. Humans have always been technological, using tools to reshape our environment. But modern technology has reached a scale and power that can fundamentally disrupt planetary systems that evolved over millions of years. Nuclear weapons can destroy civilization in hours. Industrial production can alter the atmosphere and climate. Synthetic chemicals can persist in ecosystems for generations, accumulating in food chains and damaging life in ways we don't fully understand. The danger comes from applying technology with the mindset of separation and control rather than participation and harmony. When you see yourself as separate from nature, technological power becomes a tool for dominating and extracting without regard for systemic consequences. You treat symptoms without understanding causes, solve immediate problems while creating worse problems downstream. optimize one variable while creating catastrophic imbalances in others. Watts advocated for what would now be called ecological wisdom, understanding that everything's interconnected, that actions have ripple effects throughout systems, that short-term gains often create long-term disasters when you ignore systemic relationships. This requires a different kind of thinking than the linear, reductionist approach that characterizes most Western science and technology. It requires systems thinking that recognizes complexity, feedback loops, and emergent properties that can't be predicted by analyzing components in isolation. He saw the ecological crisis as ultimately a spiritual crisis, a manifestation of the illusion of separation. As long as humans feel fundamentally separate from nature, environmental destruction will continue because there's no experiential recognition that harming nature is harming ourselves. Intellectual understanding that ecosystems matter isn't enough when your deepest felt sense is that you're an isolated individual whose survival depends on exploiting everything around you. The solution, therefore, requires not just technological innovation or policy changes, but a fundamental shift in consciousness. People need to recognize their participation in nature, not through abstract belief, but through direct experience. This recognition naturally generates care for the environment because harming nature feels like harming yourself. You don't need moral commandments to not poison yourself. The recognition of non-separation makes ecological responsibility obvious rather than a sacrifice of self-interest. Watts practiced this recognition in his own life, living in a houseboat on San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water and nature, maintaining a lifestyle that was relatively simple and ecologically light. He wasn't a systematic environmentalist in the modern sense, didn't organize campaigns or write detailed policy proposals, but he embodied and taught the shift in consciousness that underlies all effective environmental action. He was also skeptical of purely technological solutions to environmental problems that don't address underlying consciousness. Electric cars and renewable energy are improvements, but if they're still driven by the consciousness of separation and consumption, they just slow the trajectory rather than fundamentally changing direction. What's needed is recognizing that satisfaction doesn't come from accumulating more stuff, but from experiencing connection with what's already here. This doesn't mean rejecting technology or advocating return to primitive life. Watts appreciated technological achievements and enjoyed modern conveniences, but he distinguished between technology used wisely, in awareness of systemic consequences, and technology applied blindly in pursuit of narrow goals without regard for broader impacts. The question isn't whether to use technology, but how to use it, from consciousness of separation or consciousness of participation. Contemporary environmental movements have largely validated Watts's analysis. Climate change, mass extinction, ocean acidification, all of these crises stem from treating Earth as a resource to be exploited rather than a living system we're part of. Technical solutions exist, but implementing them requires overcoming the consciousness of separation that makes infinite growth and consumption seem not only acceptable, but mandatory. Watts's insights point toward an ecological spirituality that grounds environmental ethics in experienced participation rather than abstract moral reasoning. You care for the environment not because someone told you to, or because of calculated future consequences, but because you recognize yourself as nature, temporarily organized in human form, but fundamentally inseparable from the air, water, soil, and other species that constitute the web of life. This recognition doesn't make environmental challenges disappear, but it changes the relationship from adversarial problem-solving to participatory adaptation. Instead of humans versus nature, it's humans recognizing their nature, figuring out how to live in ways that sustain the systems they're part of. It's the difference between defeating an enemy and healing yourself, between imposing control and finding balance, between exploitation and participation. The ecological crisis ultimately forces humanity to grow up spiritually, to recognize that the adolescent fantasy of separation and dominance no longer works at our current technological scale. Either we mature into recognition of our participation in natural systems, or we destroy the conditions that sustain us. Watts saw this challenge coming decades ago and offered wisdom about how to meet it, not through more control, but through deeper participation, not through more separation, but through recognized unity, not through defeating nature, but through understanding where nature recognizing itself. Part 9: Death, Impermanence, and the Art of Letting Go. Few philosophers have addressed death with the combination of honesty, humor, and profound insight that characterized Alan Watts's approach. Rather than offering comforting platitudes or elaborate metaphysical theories about afterlife, he invited people to look directly at death and impermanence, not as problems to be solved, but as fundamental features of existence to be understood and accepted. His exploration of mortality remains one of his most powerful contributions to living wisely. Western culture, Watts observed, maintains an odd relationship with death. On one hand, death is everywhere, in news reports, entertainment, advertising that plays on mortality fears. On the other hand, actual death is hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, removed from daily life, treated as a failure of medicine or an enemy to be defeated. People don't die at home surrounded by family. They die in institutions, attended by professionals, kept away from children and normal life. This creates a culture that's simultaneously obsessed with and in denial about death. The denial has profound psychological consequences. If you treat death as something that shouldn't happen, that represents failure or defeat, then aging becomes a disease to be fought rather than a natural process to be accepted. Every sign of mortality becomes a source of anxiety. Your entire life becomes shadowed by the fear of its ending, but you can't address that fear directly because death is treated as unmentionable in polite society. Watts contrasted this with Asian perspectives, particularly Buddhism, that placed death and impermanence at the center of spiritual wisdom. The Buddha taught that recognizing impermanence is essential for liberation from suffering. Everything that arises passes away. Clinging to what's impermanent as if it were permanent creates suffering. Accepting impermanence allows you to appreciate things while they're here, rather than constantly grieving their eventual loss. This doesn't mean being morbid or fatalistic. It means recognizing that death gives life its poignancy and value. If you lived forever, nothing would matter, because there'd be infinite time to do everything. But knowing that time is limited makes each moment precious. The cherry blossoms are beautiful, partly because they bloom briefly. A sunset is moving, partly because it doesn't last. Love is powerful, partly because the people we love won't be with us forever. Impermanence isn't a bug in existence that needs fixing. It's a feature that makes existence meaningful and beautiful. Watts enjoyed using provocative language about death to shake people out of conventional thinking. He'd say that when you die, you return to the same state you were in before you were born. Did that state trouble you? Were you suffering during the billions of years before your birth? No, because there was no you to suffer. The same will be true after death. The separate self that fears its ending is itself temporary, so when it ends, there's no one there to regret its absence. This isn't meant to be comforting in the conventional sense. It's pointing to something about the nature of existence. The separate self is a temporary pattern that arises and passes away like everything else. What you fundamentally are, consciousness itself, isn't subject to birth and death because it's not a thing that exists in time. It's what birth and death happen within. Watts was agnostic about whether individual consciousness persists after death in any form. He suggested it might, drawing on Hindu and Buddhist ideas about reincarnation, but he emphasized that whether it does or doesn't isn't the crucial question. The crucial question is whether you're alive right now, whether you're actually living or just preparing to live someday when conditions are finally perfect. The fear of death, he argued, stems largely from the illusion of the separate self. If you think you're a separate entity trapped in a body, then death is the ultimate threat, the annihilation of everything you are. But if you recognize yourself as a temporary expression of the cosmos, then death is just the natural conclusion of this particular expression, like a wave dissolving back into the ocean. The wave hasn't gone anywhere. It's returned to what it always was. He also pointed out the paradox that the fear of death often prevents people from fully living. They're so anxious about life ending that they can't enjoy life while it's happening. They postpone living until they feel secure, but security is impossible in a world where everything changes and eventually dies. They're like someone so worried about the movie ending that they can't enjoy watching it. Watts encouraged what he called the art of letting go, practicing non-attachment in daily life as preparation for the ultimate letting go of death. This doesn't mean not caring about anything or being emotionally detached. It means enjoying things fully while they're here without clinging to them when they pass. You can love people deeply while recognizing they won't be with you forever. You can appreciate your own life without desperately trying to make it permanent. You can pour yourself completely into activities knowing they're temporary. This approach transforms how you live right now. Instead of constantly postponing life until you've achieved security, you recognize that security is impossible and start actually living. Instead of treating each day as mere preparation for some future achievement, you recognize that this day is your life, the only life you'll ever have, and you might as well be fully alive while you're here. Watts also addressed the fear of the dying process itself, distinct from fear of death. The dying process could involve pain, loss of control, indignity, suffering. These are legitimate concerns, but he pointed out that fixating on worst-case scenarios creates present suffering about possible future suffering. The dying process might be easy or difficult, peaceful or painful, but worrying about it now doesn't prevent future difficulty. It just adds present anxiety to whatever future experience might occur. He suggested that much of the suffering associated with dying comes from resistance, from fighting against what's happening rather than accepting it. Dying, like any other experience, becomes harder when you resist it. The attempt to control the uncontrollable creates additional suffering beyond whatever physical pain might be present. Acceptance doesn't mean wanting to die or giving up on life. It means recognizing that death, when it comes, is as natural as birth, part of the same process, not a foreign invader, but the completion of the cycle. Contemporary developments, like hospice care and death with dignity movements, reflect insights that Watts articulated decades earlier. Allowing death to happen naturally, surrounded by loved ones, with appropriate pain management, but without desperate life extension measures that only prolong dying. This represents a more mature and humane approach than fighting death as if it were always wrong. Watts's perspective on death ultimately points toward a larger wisdom about impermanence and change. Everything you're attached to will eventually end. Every relationship, every pleasure, every achievement, every possession, all temporary. You can spend your life trying to hold on to things, which creates constant suffering as they inevitably slip away. Or you can learn to appreciate things while they're here, participating fully without clinging, loving deeply without demanding permanence. This capacity to let go, to appreciate without clinging, to love without possessing, to live without demanding permanence, is perhaps the most important wisdom anyone can develop. It doesn't come naturally to humans with our instinct to grasp and hold, but it can be learned, practiced in small ways daily, letting thoughts pass without chasing them, allowing feelings to arise and fade, appreciating sunsets without trying to capture them, enjoying conversations without recording them, being fully present to moments, knowing they won't return. Death is the great teacher of impermanence, the ultimate fact that can't be ignored, the event that puts everything else in perspective. Remembering death doesn't make you morbid. It clarifies what matters and what doesn't, what's worth worrying about and what isn't. When you truly recognize that your time is limited, you stop wasting it on things that don't matter and start actually living the life you have. Part 10. The Watercourse Way: Spontaneity and Freedom. One of Watts's favorite metaphors for understanding life was water, particularly flowing water. Water provides a perfect image for the kind of spontaneous, natural action that he advocated as an alternative to the Western emphasis on controlled, willful effort. Understanding the watercourse way, as he called it, drawing from Taoist tradition, offers profound insights into how to live more freely and effectively. Think about how water behaves. It always flows to the lowest place without resistance or effort. It never struggles uphill, trying to be somewhere it's not. It accepts gravity and works with it rather than fighting against it. Yet in doing so, water carves canyons, shapes continents, sustains all life. Its power comes from yielding rather than forcing, from adaptability rather than rigidity. Water also takes the shape of whatever container it's in without losing its essential nature. Pour it into a square container, and it becomes square. Pour it into a round container, and it becomes round. Yet it's still water, still itself, never compromised by its adaptability. This combination of absolute flexibility and absolute integrity provides a model for human freedom that differs completely from the Western emphasis on rigid adherence to predetermined goals. The watercourse way applies to human psychology and action in profound ways. Most people approach life like someone trying to swim against a powerful current, exhausting themselves in constant effort to get somewhere other than where the current is taking them. This might occasionally succeed through enormous effort, but usually it just creates frustration and exhaustion. The alternative is to learn to read the current, to work with it, to find the paths that require minimal effort because they're aligned with natural flow. This doesn't mean being passive or lacking direction. The skilled sailor doesn't fight the wind, but uses it skillfully to reach their destination. The martial artist doesn't meet force with force, but redirects incoming energy. The skilled communicator doesn't force their point, but finds natural openings in conversation. In each case, efficiency comes from working with, rather than against the natural flow of situations. Watts contrasted this with what he saw as the characteristically Western approach of willful control and forced outcomes. Western education emphasizes discipline, the suppression of spontaneous impulses in favor of predetermined goals. Western business culture emphasizes aggressive pursuit of objectives, meeting competition with force, overcoming obstacles through sheer determination. Western psychology treats spontaneous impulses as ID that must be controlled by rational ego. This emphasis on control and suppression creates enormous psychological tension. You're constantly at war with yourself, trying to force yourself to do things you don't want to do, trying to suppress feelings and impulses that arise naturally, trying to remake yourself according to some ideal, rather than accepting and working with your actual nature. This internal conflict consumes enormous energy and often produces the opposite of what's intended, because suppression creates rebellion. The Watercourse Way suggests a radically different approach. Understand your nature deeply enough to work with it rather than against it. If you naturally have high energy in mornings and low energy in afternoons, organize your life around that rather than forcing yourself to be equally productive all day. If you naturally need solitude after social interaction, honor that rather than trying to be constantly social. If you naturally think best while walking, incorporate walking into your thinking process rather than forcing yourself to sit at a desk. This principle extends to emotion and impulse. Instead of treating emotions as problems to be controlled, you could recognize them as natural responses that contain information and energy. Anger might indicate a boundary that's been violated. Sadness might indicate a loss that needs to be processed. Fear might indicate danger that needs attention. Rather than suppressing these feelings, you could allow them, understand them, and let them inform your response to situations. Watts emphasized that spontaneity doesn't mean impulsiveness or lack of consideration. The master musician plays spontaneously, but that spontaneity emerges from years of practice that have internalized techniques so deeply that it operates automatically. The skilled conversationalist speaks spontaneously, but that spontaneity emerges from social experience and genuine interest in others. The effective leader makes spontaneous decisions, but those decisions emerge from deep understanding of situations gained through attention and experience. True spontaneity, in other words, isn't carelessness or randomness. It's skillful action that emerges naturally from deep understanding without the interference of conscious control and second guessing. It's the freedom that comes from being so deeply trained and attuned that you can trust your responses without constantly monitoring and correcting yourself. This leads to what Watts called liberation, or genuine freedom, which isn't the same as the Western concept of freedom as unlimited choice, and lack of constraint. That kind of freedom often creates paralysis and anxiety because there are too many choices and no clear criteria for choosing. You're supposedly free, but feel trapped by endless possibilities. The freedom that Watts advocated is more like the freedom of water, the ability to adapt to circumstances, to flow around obstacles, to take the form that situations require without losing your essential nature. It's the freedom that comes from understanding yourself and the world deeply enough that appropriate action arises naturally rather than being forced through willful effort. This kind of freedom requires what he called self-knowledge, but not the Western psychological variety that involves endless analysis and self-improvement. It requires understanding your actual nature through observation and acceptance, rather than trying to remake yourself according to some ideal. When you truly understand how you naturally function, you can work with that rather than constantly fighting it. The watercourse way also involves trusting life in a way that Western consciousness often resists. Western emphasis on control and planning stems from distrust of natural processes, fear that if you don't force things to happen, nothing good will happen. But excessive control often prevents natural development that would occur spontaneously if allowed. Seeds grow without being forced. Children develop without being micromanaged. Healing happens naturally when conditions are right. Watts suggested that much of what we call spiritual practice involves getting out of your own way, stopping the interference that prevents natural functioning. Meditation isn't about creating special states through effort. It's about allowing the mind to settle naturally when you stop stirring it up. Wisdom isn't about accumulating more knowledge. It's about clearing away conceptual clutter so that clear seeing can occur naturally. The practical application of the watercourse way means approaching life more like play than work. Play is activity engaged in for its own sake, where the activity itself is the point rather than some future outcome. Children at play are completely absorbed, not thinking about getting somewhere or achieving something, just fully engaged in what they're doing. This quality of absorption, of losing yourself in activity, is what work becomes when approached with the watercourse way. Most people treat work as something to get through, a means to an end, focused entirely on the outcome rather than the process. But this makes work miserable and often less effective because you're not fully engaged. When you bring the quality of play to work, becoming absorbed in the activity itself rather than fixated on results, work becomes more enjoyable and usually produces better results because you're fully present rather than divided. The watercourse way ultimately points toward a style of living that's more flowing, more spontaneous, more trusting of natural process, less forceful, less rigid, less anxiously controlling. It doesn't promise that everything will turn out perfectly or that you'll never face difficulties. It suggests that you'll navigate difficulties more skillfully and enjoy life more fully when you learn to work with the current rather than constantly fighting against it.